extent that he does put slides up, he'll describe them for those of you listening from home. I'm Paul Eldrinkamp. I'm president for the moment of Passive House, Massachusetts, and I saw at this Building Energy 15 conference this past March. I attended a whole-day workshop on the grid, and Nathan was a co-presenter. And I describe it as sort of the dollar's eye view of the grid. And it sounds like a dry topic, and I'm primarily a remodeling contractor, passive house consultant, so I don't get into policy that much. I don't get into the economics of the grid that much, but that full-day workshop was absolutely fascinating. I was literally on the edge of my seat, hanging on by my teeth during much of the conversation. It's just unbelievable how the economics of the grid works. I mean, electricity producers in New England, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I hope I remember this right, will make all of their net profit for the year in about 10 hours of peak load. Is that fairly accurate?
Yeah.
And anyway, and wind and solar, large wind and solar producers will often bid negative numbers, like
into the wholesale market.
Into the wholesale market, but they're still able to make money because of incentives and subsidies and things like that. So you can imagine. Anyway, I won't embarrass myself by getting into the weeds of something that I'm really not qualified to get into, particularly since we have Nathan himself here. But immediately after the workshop, I said to Nathan, "You've got to come to the Passive House group and talk to us about what zero net energy means from the grid's eye point of view." And speak before us. I think he figured that was probably the easiest way to get rid of me.
very much supposed to be fluid. So maybe your name, which I won't remember, by the way, and what you do. Maybe if you work on residential stuff, or do you dabble in C&I type of stuff? So, Paul.
Paul Undercamp, residential remodeling contractor and passive house, zero energy, deep energy retrofit consultant.
I'm Jim Matakowski with the Grange Cocoon. We insulate mostly residential and some commercial projects.
Steve Bazak, I'm an architect, specialize in passive houses, low energy, zero energy homes, retrofits, etc.
I'm Fred Gordon. I'm a developer doing 65 units of passive house in South Boston. Just a couple of things. You know, we put PV on a building on site. We will not put it on the new building because we want it our parkland on the roof, and we think it's sort of crazy.
Apologize up in advance. I wrote those rules.
Well, I knew what you were like when you said you were a regulator. But we'll forgive it.
Oliver Klein, sales rep and consultant with 475 High Performance Building Supply. So we help to optimize the enclosures for air tightness and overall performance before the solar goes on it.
Residential?
Mostly residential, but also commercial.
Okay.
I'm Willamette University associate architect at Cambridge, and mostly institutional work, but I'm personally interested.
I'll take a studio, like an architecture firm together, and we do a wide variety of things, mostly residential by ourselves, and partner with other people on institutional healthcare.
You look familiar. I might have seen you at a conference or something.
My name is Maya. I'm residential and commercial, and I'm also passive house.
Hank Keating, I'm the Vice President of Design and Construction, Trinity Financial. We do large-scale affordable housing projects. We've been moving it toward much more energy-efficient projects, and I've recently completed a passive house for myself.
Congratulations.
I'm Ellen Denoyer. I'm an architect, primarily commercial work, but making my own house right now.
John Chase, residential architect. Just here on a personal interest in passive house.
Norman Curlup, architect, construction manager. I work with developers and private owners. I have a hard time convincing them to go passive solar, so I would like to have some arguments to sell them. Especially it comes from cost and the concept of why solar, why passive.
Sure.
I think aesthetically there is something wrong there, going passive, especially in high-end residential projects.
My name is David Kelman. I'm a residential realtor with Keller Williams, working almost exclusively residential. I've done a lot of energy efficiency work in my house, including some solar. And as part of this practice, I'm trying to promote energy efficiency, either for new construction or people that are doing remodel or retrofits in their home. And I'm here more.
Michael Haskell, again, an architect. I've practiced in Boston area for 35 years, and the last 5 years I've been in Vancouver, British Columbia, to a conference in Seattle last fall. Interested in that.
John Unger, just an interested person. Christopher Haynes. I'm an architect. I'm Passive House certified, Living Building Challenge ambassador, focusing on materials specifically in built environment, living building challenge bed lists and such, specification writing and consulting on that.
My name is Mike Duclos, and I'm a Passive House consultant.
Great, thank you, everyone. So just to be perfectly blunt, you have a lot more knowledge about some of this stuff, related to actually building and stuff like that. My expertise is really in electricity policy, financials, the stuff that normally puts people to sleep. I live and breathe that type of stuff. I want to try to set the stage a little bit about electric utilities and how they work, because I think to really understand the bigger picture here when it comes to energy, electricity in particular, that we need to kind of understand the motivation of electric utilities, where they're coming from. So how many people here know the difference between a restructured market and a vertically integrated market? Okay, a few, okay. So, and by the way, I'm not setting anyone up to failure here. I'm just trying to get a feel for what each of you knows. A vertically integrated market is what we traditionally think of a utility. So they own generation, they own transmission, and they own the distribution of electricity. They own it all. A restructured market, the utility only distributes the electricity. So there's a competitive market for the generation of electricity. There's a competitive market for the transmission of electricity. So basically, the voltage levels at which a restructured electric utility works are more or less the lines that you'd see running down a residential street. To get technical, there were some engineers in here, more or less around the 69 kV or less voltage level. This is important because utilities in Massachusetts, and most of New England, Vermont's the exception, they make their money off of distributing electricity. They don't make any money off of the generation of electricity. So that right there changes the discussion and the motivations for electric utilities in Massachusetts and most of New England. They don't make a dime off of generation. They don't care if there's less electricity being generated. They only make money by delivering the electricity to your household. Okay.
Why is that?
It goes back to the 1990s. And thank you for asking questions. I strongly encourage that. It goes back to the 1990s. At that time, there were a lot of contracts that utilities entered into, and those contracts were really expensive. So people were paying high prices for electricity. Some people came along and are like, you know what? Why do we even have a monopoly entity generating electricity here? That can be a completely competitive market, thereby driving down the cost. So especially in the Northeast, states started to restructure, meaning they required the utilities to sell off all of their generation assets, sell off the transmission assets, or split into different companies. And the idea was you use competitive forces to drive down the prices of wholesale electricity. Now, the reason why we don't have competitive market for the distribution of electricity is how many people want multiple electricity wires running down their street? It's not very efficient. It's not very economically efficient. So that is still a monopoly enterprise. But you can have people building power plants and competing on that front.
Did that work? Did it drive prices down?
Well, there's a little bit of debate on that. So we don't have a clear answer. What we do know is it's been pretty successful in the Northeast. How many people have heard of Enron? Not so successful in California. And that was because of corruption, in all honesty. You get some people that say when it comes to restructured markets that they're not really saving any money. It's better to have the utilities doing everything. Unfortunately, you get into counterfactuals, meaning we don't know what the price of electricity would be if it was still vertically integrated. So you don't have a clear comparison of how the market's working now compared to how it otherwise would have worked. So there's still some debate on that. I am firmly in the camp that restructured markets are a good thing for customers.
Closing down limits.
Yes, we do see that that play out in different ways. Now, in some respects, it's a blessing and a curse. So, for instance, we've now had 2 nuke plants announced that they're closing in New England. We had Vermont, Yankee, and now Plymouth. On the flip side of that, what's happened is over the past 20 years or so, there's been a lot of natural gas power plants being built. And so New England's heavily dependent upon natural gas now. That's good. It's better than coal. It's cleaner than coal. It's bad, though, because we don't actually have any natural gas in New England. So that does create some problems when in the middle of the winter, for instance, people are heating their homes with natural gas. You have the power plant saying, we literally don't have enough supply to run our power plants. And so this has created a whole nother discussion, which I don't plan on going into, about we need larger amounts of natural gas supply in New England, pipelines and stuff. You may hear some people really vocally opposing new pipelines and the such. So there are benefits and drawbacks to having a competitive market without a doubt. Any other questions on that front? Yes.
You said Vermont was the exception.
Yes. So Vermont, in the 90s, they said, you know, we do have expensive contracts right now. Specifically, Vermont entered into long-term contracts with Hydro-Quebec for power. But they decided to ride it out. So that meant that in the 90s, they were paying a lot more for electricity. Towards the tail end of those contracts, they were paying less for electricity than everyone else was paying. So, you know, it depends on how do you evaluate contracts, whether or not that was a good deal or not. Nonetheless, Vermont's still an interesting situation, and by the way, they're going big gangbusters up there in solar. Yeah.
In my hometown, they provide the electricity, and they're not allowing any solar energy company to come in and provide solar panels, and they don't want to give any rebates. They don't want to cooperate with them. So how can we get out of this situation?
Yeah, I'm really happy you brought that up because I meant to mention it earlier. I'm going to focus on investor-owned utilities, meaning utilities that are actually doing this to make money. There is a whole nother batch of utilities, normally referred to as municipal utilities. You may hear me refer to them as munis. By the way, if I use any terminology you don't understand, stop me, let me know. In regard to munis, traditionally, they're viewed as a good thing because they're not making any money. That's not their goal, to make money, make a profit. So the price of electricity tends to be lower than in the investor-owned utility service areas. However, the drawback of that is you don't normally see any innovative policies from munis. A lot of the munis tend to be, what's the bare minimum we have to do to make sure that everyone has electricity? Any of the other stuff, such as energy efficiency, solar and stuff, that's just stuff we don't want to pay for. On the bright side, munis tend to be governed by local people, whether it's they're a board that's elected in the town or the selectmen or something like that. So on the bright side, it's easy to go and approach the people that are actually regulating the utility, the muni, as the case may be. So it can be easier to try to get some momentum in the town to try to effectuate change. But it actually requires legwork to actually go and talk to the people and try to really make something happen.
My experience is that they do not participate in big rebate programs.
They don't. There's a couple reasons for that. So, for instance, have everyone here heard of a renewable portfolio standard? The RECs that you get, the renewable energy certificates, those are used to meet, if you sell them, renewable portfolio standard obligations. Munis are not required to do that. They're not required to participate in that program. They could voluntarily do it. Also, the energy efficiency. They could voluntarily do it, but they're not required to by state law. Whereas the investor-owned utilities are required to participate by law. The energy efficiency programs, renewable energy programs that are implemented by the state, those only apply to the investor-owned utilities. They're not required, the munis are not required to participate in those programs. So they don't pay into the programs, but they don't receive the benefits of the programs either. So munis, they can be a tough nut to crack. Yeah.
But it's still doable. June of last year, Braintree opened up a solar farm on the old town dump, and I believe they're talking about putting some panels on a number of the schools and municipal buildings. So it's more challenging, but clearly doable.
Absolutely. And the reason you see that type of thing happen in munis tends to be from the ground up. People in the town make it well known that they want these types of programs. You don't see the state telling the munis that they have to be doing these types of programs, the top-down approach, if you will. So if you can organize people in a muni to get something done, you got a fighting chance. You're not going to really get the state to tell the munis to do anything. All right. How many people know what I mean by an electric tariff? Okay. I'm just going to assume that you're going to put your hand up every time. So stop. This starts to get into the arcane nature of electric utility regulation. You know, when I was younger, I heard the term tariff, and I thought that just meant a tax. Well, it's actually not really what a tariff is. A tariff is the rules and conditions, the terms and conditions, and the prices that the utilities can charge customers. So basically the way in which they operate and the prices that the utilities can charge to customers. Now, this is really important because how many of you have ever tried to read an electric bill? And how many of you went, what the hell's going on here? Yeah, exactly. So the electric bill comes directly from the tariffs. The prices that you pay for electricity, all of that stuff. If you want to understand how an electric bill works, you really have to understand how tariffs work. Now, the reason I bring this up is because when you go to read an electric bill, whether you have a customer who wants to try to understand, like, how much electricity do I need to generate in order to, you know, become net zero or anything like that, you really need to dig down into how much electricity are they using. You know, if they want to do it from a financial perspective, how much are they being charged for electricity? And how has that changed over time? So that's what really necessitates trying to understand what the electric utility is actually doing. And keep in mind, for the investor-owned utilities, everything they do, virtually everything they do, has to get approved by the state agencies, the Department of Public Utilities. The reason for that is they're a monopoly. When you're subject to a monopoly, you don't have any choice. It's not like you can say, my electric utility sucks, I'm going to go get service from a different electric utility. You don't have that option in a monopoly. So in order to make sure that ratepayers, customers, aren't being, pardon my French, screwed over by the utilities, the state regulates them to make sure that what they're doing is appropriate. So I don't know if that brings you comfort or anxiety, but the electric utilities have to do everything. Their tariffs have to be approved by the state agency, the Department of Public Utilities in Massachusetts, before they can be implemented, before the electric utility can start charging people, for instance, a different rate. When you're looking at your customer's bill, there's 3 potential options in which they will be charged. There's the customer charge. That's a flat fee for just being a customer of the utility. In New England right now, you're talking in the range of $5 to $10. There's an energy charge, that's your kilowatt hour charge. That's what people normally see for the bulk of their electricity bill. And then the third type is a demand charge. You don't see this on residential customers yet. You normally see this in commercial and industrial customers. So a demand charge is how much electricity is a person using at any given point in time. Basically, you can think of it as going to a fair and that weight, you go and hit it and see how far it rises. Well, you can think of your maximum electricity usage being how high does that weight rise. So think about during the summer, maybe when you have your air conditioner running, if you have an electric hot water heater, you have coffee brewing, you have the toaster going, all of that draws a lot of electricity at once, and that can be your peak demand. Another way to think about this is water, because people visualize water. You don't normally want to see electricity. So think of a pipe. How big that pipe is the demand. How much water running through that pipe is the actual kilowatt hours, the actual energy. So how big the pipe is how much electricity you could be drawing at any given point in time. All right, now here's the key question. How do utilities make money?
Careful.
Carefully, good job. Yes, they are careful about it, actually. Utilities make money by building stuff. A lot of times when I ask that question, people think they make money by selling electricity. Now, that's how they recover money. But they make money by building stuff. Whenever there's new customers that come into town and new development or something like that, they need to build a new substation, a lot of money is required to do that. Utilities get a return on investment on that infrastructure. And then they go to the regulator to figure out what rates they can charge to recover their return on investment. Fundamentally, though, if utilities aren't building stuff, they're not going to be making money in the future. That right there is the crux of the issue when it comes to utility opposition to stuff that reduces demand. Demand being electricity usage. If electricity usage is going down, that reduces the need for electric utilities to build stuff in the future. And that reduction in their need to build stuff means that it reduces their earning opportunities in the future. Flip it around, if the amount of electricity being used is going up and up and up, utilities have to build, they make money, and they're happy, happy, happy.
I thought the thrust of rebate programs for them was to avoid additional capital investment.
You're thinking like a ratepayer or a regulator. And I agree with you. I agree with you. That is proper public policy. But from the perspective of the utility, any of the rebate programs, the energy efficiency programs, and stuff like that, it is a chunk taking out of their earning potential in the future. Why do they do it then? They're required to do it. For energy efficiency programs, the utilities actually make money off of doing that. The state recognized going back into the 80s that if we're going to get utilities to actually do these types of programs that we want to see them do, we're going to have to throw them a bone of some way, shape, or form. We're going to have to give them some type of opportunity to make money. Keep in mind, not all the states took this approach. Some states said, we're just going to have somebody else do energy efficiency. Screw you, utilities, go home. But in Massachusetts, the decision was made that in order to get the utilities to do energy efficiency, we're going to provide them an opportunity to make money off of that. So basically, they make money off of the number of energy efficiency measures that they do. Yes?
But it seems that the utilities are still conflicted then.
Absolutely.
Depending on how successful they are with their energy efficiency programs, they're reducing the potential for future profits.
Absolutely.
What about investment in the so-called smart grid? We hear
type of stuff, grid of the future type of stuff, and also make money off of what you were doing for the past 100 plus years. So we still have a tension there. And keep in mind, when it comes to doing solar, utilities don't have, as currently, they do not have any way to make money off of customers installing solar. People installing solar just reduces their earning potential in the future. And that fundamentally is why we've seen utilities put up a lot of opposition to solar. Yeah.
Just to be a little mean-spirited, with the energy efficiency programs, which the utilities make some money on, administering and sort of, don't they sort of have an interest in collecting that money for programs that don't work particularly well?
Yes. I mean, the short answer is yes. If somebody can make money by doing a bad program and it doesn't hurt their bottom line, sure, that's like free money. That's why.
Explains a lot, huh, Fred? You set up the system. So.
That's why it's so important to have regulators that are overseeing these programs to make sure that they're done well. They're done to they achieve the best possible outcome. And that's why you have ratepayer advocates. In Massachusetts, the ratepayer advocate is the Attorney General, meaning that they're the entity that advocates for all customers, especially residential customers in the state. And then you have the regulators digging through the books and the spreadsheets and all of that stuff to make sure that the programs are actually doing well. There's always that tension there, though. Always. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that some states decided to use a separate entity to implement their energy efficiency programs. Can you compare and contrast how those have succeeded, those states?
Yeah, people have done that. You know, a good example of a state that chose somebody else altogether to do energy efficiency is Vermont. So Vermont has the Vermont Investment, or Energy Investment Corporation. Yeah, thank you. And so they're not affiliated with utilities at all, and they do the energy efficiency. You can compare the programs. The problem you run into is you're not exactly comparing apples to apples. So each state is different. You know, Vermont has a lower density than, say, Massachusetts, especially if you compare Vermont to California. You have altogether different climates, and so it becomes very difficult to compare the programs. People do it all the time, though. All right. Now, the reason I brought up how utilities make money is because once you start to understand that issue, you can understand where the utilities are coming from. And to be honest, I'm not trying to say that utilities are inherently bad, or especially people that work for utilities are bad. They just have a different motivation than, say, I do. And so once you recognize their motivation, what they're trying to achieve, it becomes a lot easier to understand why something is or isn't getting done. So that's really what I wanted to convey to you is utilities have a motivation to make money, and they make money by building stuff. Now, something you may or may not know is that utilities actually, they're monopolies, but they don't have any innate right to operate as a monopoly. So when you come to the investor-owned utilities, they're granted a franchise right, a franchise charter, if you will, to operate in a certain area by the customers and lawmakers and stuff. The reason I bring this up is because if utilities really fuck up, you can actually reject or revoke that franchise. And this has happened in some places. So Boulder, Colorado, Boulder decided that they did not like the job that Excel was doing. And so they said, Excel, you're out. We're revoking your franchise right to operate. And as a result, Boulder now has immunity. That same type of thing can happen. It doesn't happen often, but it can happen anywhere. Now, for those of you, some of you may remember back into 2010, there was a huge ice storm that hit here in Massachusetts. Anyone work in the Fitchburg area? So Unitil, the small utility that's 4 towns, investor-owned utility that operates in the Fitchburg area, they had 100% outages, meaning every single person in their service territory was out of electricity. And it lasted a while. This really, really angered some people in that service territory. Not surprising. Nobody likes to be without electricity. And so, as a result of that, there was a moment in time where the people really tried to get the state to, and their elected officials to reject the franchise of utility in their towns. They tried to set up a muni in these towns. Now, the only problem is when you do this, you actually have to reimburse the utility for their infrastructure, you know, the poles, the
before about how they only make money off the building stuff. That's because they own the equity of the material assets, and then they get paid back through the distribution.
By the way, the Department of Public Utilities is 2 blocks that way. So utility then goes to the regulator and said, we built this infrastructure. We want to get a return on that investment. There's other ways that the utility can make money, by the way. So for instance, let's say they come in for a rate case. The rate case is a huge ordeal. It's the process by which the utility comes in and says, all right, this is what we want to make for our rate of return. This is what we propose the rates are going to be. And normally those rates are in effect for a few years, 3, 5 years, somewhere in that range. For budgets, and they make more money that way. You don't normally see that type of thing because it's not really the best way to run a company. But you can see that if, for instance, the utility is trying to make themselves look really good, meaning they're making a lot of money, so they could be bought out by somebody else. You see that type of situation happen occasionally. So I wanted to talk a little bit about solar policy in Massachusetts. Hopefully I get a fair amount of hands for this one. How many people have heard of net metering? Okay, good. So just a quick recap, net metering is the process by which a customer that installs distributed generation, renewable energy, solar, wind, and such, the process by which they interact with the utility, using electricity on site. If they generate more electricity than they're using, they push that electricity back onto the grid. And then when they're using more electricity than they're generating, so let's say you have solar and it's night out, then you use the electricity for the grid. And so literally what's happening is there is a meter that's measuring the net flows back and forth. And the meter can spin. Visually, this is how I describe it. It can be more complicated, but visually you have a meter that could be spinning forward when they're using more electricity than they're generating, and it can spin backwards when they're generating more electricity than they're using. And then the utility comes around about once a month, reads that meter. If it's negative, it means they generated more electricity over the course of the month than they used. If it's positive, it means they used more electricity than they generated. If it's negative, that means that they get a credit on their bill. And those are called net metering credits, not really that complicated. This is the program that was really my baby when I was at know that the cap has been reached in the National Grid Service territory. Okay, good, good. All right, so I have to get up on my little soapbox now and do a little policy preach to you. If you care about net metering and the growth of solar in Massachusetts, please call your elected officials and the Speaker of the House to try to encourage them to raise the net metering cap in Massachusetts. It's hugely important. It's one of the things that I work on. Anyway, so please, yes.
Could you explain what you mean by net capped?
Sure, absolutely. So in Massachusetts, written into statute, there's a percentage cap on how much net metering can be installed in each service territory. Now that percentage is based on the highest historical peak load. So you think of the hottest summer day when everyone's using air conditioning and such, and the amount of electricity that the collective customers of a utility are using, that's their peak load. And then a percentage of that can be installed in the form of net metering.
What are those percentages?
So it gets a little bit complicated because there's two caps actually. So there's a cap for governmental entities, so your cities and towns, the government buildings and such, state buildings, federal buildings, and stuff like that. And then there's a cap on private entities. The private cap is the one that's really being hit right now, and the current caps are 4% and 6%. Yes.
Why is there a cap?
Excellent question. Theoretically, the public policy argument is that net metering there's a cost associated with it. And so it's a ratepayer protection, so that ratepayers don't end up paying a whole lot of money for a program. Now,
so 90% of the people were generating their own electricity. The other 10%
Excellent. Good job. I'm going to be getting to this argument, right? You know, it's on my notes here. But great job. That's absolutely one of the concerns there.
That would be economic justice.
Yes. A motivating factor for the last 10%. Absolutely.
Yeah, with the program.
Yes. Now, just to be clear, though, the concerns about the cost of net metering, I would argue, need to be taken into account of the benefits of net metering, too. So you look at the net cost or the net benefit of the program. The studies in Massachusetts have been pretty clear that there's a net benefit, but the utilities have been very vocal about the cost. And so currently the legislature is in they're stuck in mud, if you will, and they're not doing anything because the utilities keep on saying that these programs cost too much, even though it's pretty clear that there are net benefits associated with these programs. Okay, I'll try to get off the soapbox now, unless you have any questions. Yes?
How does that affect the individual who wanted to participate in net metering? Does that mean that those meters aren't available, or simply that, you know, once the collective amount has been reached, there's no more rebate on their bill or something?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the way it would work is that once the net metering caps are reached in a service territory, that program is no longer open, closed, if you will, for people that want to come and net meter. The utility says, no, you can't do it anymore. There is an exception, by the way. I don't want to misguide you if, say, you have residential customers that are worried about this. I'm very proud of this personally. I guess it was about 4 years ago now, I pushed to have an exemption for small systems from the net metering caps. So your residential scale systems are not capped by net metering. It's the larger systems. So getting into the small commercial, medium sized, and obviously like the solar farms and stuff like that, those are all capped.
When do they open up again? Like when you reach the cap, and then that yearly, and then
it requires the legislature to make a change to the statute, which is why it's so important that you call your legislators and tell them to raise the net metering caps.
Should they tell them that figure in terms of kilowatt hour? I have like a small system, which is only 2.
Sure.
But is there a cutoff point that they won't?
Yes. So I was trying to spare some people, but no, I'm happy to go dive into the details. So for single phase electricity service, engineers in the room know what I'm meaning? Okay. So that's more or less your more rural areas of an electricity grid. The cap starts to apply for systems greater than 10 kilowatts. So most of the time, your average residential is in the range of like 6, depends on the situation, a lot of variables. But the cap starts to apply for 10 kilowatts and above. On 3-phase service, the cap is 25 kilowatts for above.
So it can change owners, but that's
Correct.
a net meter?
Yep, so basically the utility comes and swaps out your meter. So honestly, I've had the Vote Solar website up just because it's easy and I didn't want a blank screen. But you'll notice on some of the squares on the Vote Solar website, this kilowatt hours here, this is actually a picture of a utility meter. It's zoomed in. But that actual meter is swapped out for a net meter. Now, the reason they have to swap them out is because back in the day, and going back 100 years, all utility meters used to be net meters. They could spin backwards and forwards. But people actually realized that you could go and spin the meter backwards and not be charged as much by the electric utility. So in order to prevent fraud, most electric meters can't spin backwards. Now, I'll bring up real quick a website. So this website is MassACA. ACA stands for Application for Cap Allocation. On this website, it gives you basically real-time updates as to where the net metering caps are.
So one of my questions is how much capacity is left in government caps?
There's still a decent amount left, but we can get the exact update from this. So right here on the top, we have private, on the bottom we have public, and it has each of the service territories. And then it tells you how big the cap is, how much is interconnected already, how much has been reserved at the net metering cap, and then ultimately how much capacity is available under the cap here. And this is in kilowatts. And then you see this wait list over here, the far right-hand column. This is basically because the cap has been reached, and so people are in line to get their ability to become net metering customers. And actually, I'm sorry, I'm wrong. The National Grid, private and public, are both reached. So the future of solar in Massachusetts is in jeopardy.
Does that a count of meters?
No, this is a count of capacity, kilowatts.
Kilowatts, okay, thank you. All right, thanks.
So if somebody wanted to install a solar system in National Grid, could only do that if they were going to be completely off the grid?
You can always install solar. It's just a matter of how your electricity is going to be treated. So even if the net metering caps are closed, there's still federal laws. This goes back to 1978 in the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act. You can always install distributed generation, or generation in general. That's renewable. But you won't receive retail rate for any electricity that you export back to the grid.
So it's selling back to the utility.
Yes, exactly. So it really changes the financial.
What's the rate that would be the default rate?
If you didn't have net metering?
Yeah, if you were beyond the capacity of net metering, you did it anyways.
Yep.
You're not getting the retail rate. What do you get?
It depends. Just like a lot of things in the electricity world, there's no simple answer to that. It depends on the size of the system, but more or less it's going to be based on the wholesale rate of electricity, which depends, but you're talking in the range of 4 or 5 cents per kilowatt hour. So much less than retail rate. Yeah.
You're capping on kilowatts and not on numbers being distributed. How are they determining if it's saying that if they're using 1 kilowatt, how do they determine?
You just made a very common mistake. Conflating capacity with energy. So kilowatts is capacity. How much could the solar system produce at any given point in time? It's the potential. And energy is how much is it actually producing, kilowatt hours. And so this is based on capacity, the potential to produce electricity.
Yeah. I don't want to waste everybody's time because I think you made yourself clear, but I'll ask it anyway. We've got 100 PV panels up. We have enough room for 200 more. We figured that the 30% tax credit is up in 2016, so we can wait till 2016. But we're screwed actually because although we can get the tax credit and the accelerated depreciation, we can't get RECs. Is that correct?
Not exactly. So it's very common to merge 2 solar programs in Massachusetts, net metering and for solar, it's the SREC program, the Solar Renewable Energy Certificate program. Those are actually 2 different things. You could be eligible for SRECs even if you're not eligible for net metering.
Okay, so we get SRECs now. That's what we get.
More than likely, yeah.
Are we okay?
Going forward?
Yeah, can we
once you lock in your eligibility for SREC,
panels now and another 100 later on.
Yeah,
What
they
do you
all
do?
agree.
Because that's what with my house, I'd have to buy. I have system in place, and I'm getting SREC, and I'm getting net metering. But what happens if I want to add some? If I want to zone what my house is electric rather than oil, am I going to have to put more panels? How are they going to treat panels?
I'm sorry.
No, what I'm saying is, I think a lot of it is how you structure the program. I was told that if I wanted to expand my panels on my roof, rather than simply adding on 4 more panels, they would have to put 4 more panels, inverter, and I'd have to be essentially I'd be having two separate systems using two separate meters, and SREC can be treated a little bit differently.
Yeah, it does become very complicated when you make changes to a system. I will say that.
Let me try to clarify something.
Sure.
Net metering is when a meter goes backwards.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we never go backwards because the amount, even with 300 PV panels, we're just doing a fraction. I mean, this is a 100,000 square foot building. So, is it correct to say we don't have anything to worry about until 2016?
More than likely. So the real issue there, is instantaneously, do you ever generate more electricity than you use? If you never ever generate more electricity than you use, actually you don't really need net metering. There's no reason for you to have net metering because you'll never be exporting to the grid. So in that situation, you could just become what's called a qualifying facility pursuant to federal rules, and that just requires that the electric utility interconnect you, and you never have to worry about how much electricity you're going to be generating, because it will always be your downside.
That's a really important point, because I think a lot of people have PV which never approaches their total load, supplemental. And certainly with large commercial buildings, case.
Details matter. Definitely with larger commercial, that can be the case.
Can I ask a quick question?
Of course.
You said residential is exempt from the camp. Did you mean single family or multi-family?
I was being a little loose with my terminology there. I mean, it's not exactly worded that residential is exempt from the cap. It's either 10 kilowatt systems or below are exempt from the cap if you're on single phase, or 25 kilowatts and below if you're on 3-phase electricity service. Normally, that's residential and small commercial.
Just for pacing purposes, we have till 8 o'clock.
Yep.
I mean, I would love for this to be another 8-hour workshop.
All right, just out of curiosity, how many people here have done systems that are off-grid? Does anyone? We don't normally see off-grid stuff in Massachusetts. Maybe in like northern New England. Obviously out in the western United States, you see a lot more off-grid applications. Oh yeah, absolutely. There's no requirement that you're electrically interconnected to the grid.
Even the western Massachusetts.
Well, there's a number of off the grid in Massachusetts, but they're individual here and there.
Yeah, they're not common, if you will.
They're here. I'm looking to do that on my house actually in the next year or two. I've already planned it all out. Hopefully I can get it done.
So here's the thing when it comes to off-grid applications, though. Your eligibility for SRECs goes out the door. You're no longer eligible for SREC if you're off the grid. And you start to change the dynamic of how you interact with the utility if you're not electrically interconnected with the utility. And you start to just rambling. Or when you're electrically interconnected, and I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't go off grid, by the way, but when you're electrically interconnected, the electricity you generate, especially from solar, has a lot of value, not only to yourself, but also to society. So for instance, when you generate electricity at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when a lot of businesses are operating and stuff, there's a lot of load on the electric system in general. What happens is you start to push the price of wholesale electricity down. Have enough installed capacity to serve what you need. And even if you have batteries on site where you could be off the grid, it actually may be better for society if you're electrically interconnected. Now here's the problem. You know how we talked about how utilities make a lot of money by building stuff, and they don't like solar because it requires them not to build as much stuff? Well, what happens when a lot of people start to build solar?
They have to build less.
They have to build less. Have any of you ever heard of the proverbial utility death spiral?
Yes.
What?
Death.
Yes.
Exactly what you brought up earlier. As more and more customers install solar, distributed energy resources in general, so including that energy efficiency, energy conservation, demand response, and the such. As more and more customers start to do these technologies, it reduces the need for the electric utility. And the electric utility starts to have to collect their revenue over fewer and fewer kilowatt hours, fewer and fewer customers. And so what that does is the price per kilowatt hour starts to increase, which, as you said earlier, motivates customers to do more and more distributed energy resources. And so that is the essence, if you will, of the death spiral. And this has scared utilities. Not surprising. They start to see a future in which their business model doesn't make as much sense.
But can't the business models change so they're getting reimbursed for distribution?
They will be the first.
Spoken after my own heart, and this is exactly what's starting to happen. New York is out on the forefront of this. In New York, there's something called the Reforming the Energy Vision, and it's all about changing how utilities make money, changing the whole business model. However, change doesn't come easily in an electric utility world. So, and it's not just the electric utilities either, actually. I will say that regulatory agencies, they don't change very quickly either. And it's for a good reason. You normally don't want electric utilities or regulators to be going off on these crazy ideas, trying to do innovative things, because ultimately it's the customers that have to pay for any of these crazy ideas. That's why you traditionally don't see much in the way of innovation in electric utilities. However, electric utilities around the country have seen this kind of future in which distributed energy resources are much more prevalent.
The reaction has been
Well, it depends. Mostly bad.
Yeah.
There are some exceptions. For instance, I have to give a shout out to Green Mountain Power in Vermont. How many times have I mentioned Vermont during this meeting?
Yeah.
They do a lot of cool stuff up there. So Green Mountain Power, actually, they're an investor-owned utility, but they decided we're changing the purpose of the company. Our purpose is no longer just to make money. The purpose of Green Mountain Power is to be a better company for their ratepayers. It's kind of like the anti-utility, in all honesty, and they actually use that term, and it's quite funny, especially when they're around other utilities.
I mean, how different is this, say, gas company? I mean, 100 years from now, people are obviously driving gas vehicles, or even eating gas. So, they're on a death spiral. It just might not be quick or whatever. But they're on a death spiral too, right?
Absolutely.
100 years there, so get with the program.
You're speaking to me again, so I'm like, hell yeah. However, there's a lot of people that have a very large vested interest in keeping the status quo. I'll phrase it like that. And so innovation and change is coming slowly. And so what we've seen from some of the utilities around the country is stuff like high customer charges. So remember I mentioned earlier on that charge for just being a customer of the utility? It's normally $5, $10 or something. In Wisconsin, some utilities now, it's $50. Go to Hawaii, it could be $80. So before you ever use any electricity, you're already responsible for $80. How many people's electric bill is under $80 right now? That is startling. I mean, and that's the type of proposals that we're actually seeing around the country now. We've also seen an emphasis on demand charges. So right now, most residential customers don't have a demand charge. Some utilities, including National Grid in Massachusetts, are trying to move residential customers to demand-based rates, meaning they will charge you for the amount of electricity that you use at any point in time, not just how much electricity.
Are they putting ratchet charges on?
You could be teaching this class.
I could. I spent 20-odd years in energy efficiency systems.
So what National Grid has proposed, and they made a filing this past Friday, so I haven't had a chance to read it yet. But what they've proposed is basically an in-term demand charge, meaning they're going to, and the logic isn't very sound. I'm very biased, but it's not sound. Basically, they're going to use as a proxy to demand your total energy uses. So they're going to use kilowatt hours to estimate your kilowatt demand.
Solid.
So it's once again not very sound, but their purpose of doing this, their express written purpose of doing this, is to eventually switch residential customers over to demand-based rates. So that will really fundamentally change the way residential customers start to be charged for electricity services.
Actual building of things. So wouldn't they want to own more of the new systems rather than reconfigure the way they charge for their existing systems?
Yeah.
Wouldn't they want to own further down the line in the delivery? Or, if it goes so, if it's solar, they,
Yep.
They go all the way to the panel or not. But
some companies, some utilities, especially in the Mountain West, Southwest, are really, really big on, we're 100% towards solar. We're all for it as long as we own it. So that has been an approach to some utilities. It's more complicated in New England, Massachusetts, because we go back to so that changes the discussion here. $2 charge per kilowatt.
So the utility actually charges you directly for owning solar panels.
Exactly.
It's penalty.
Yep. And then other utilities have said, you know, solar customers, they're kind of different. Let's put them in a separate rate class. And once you put them in a separate rate class, you can start to treat them differently. Basically, you can start to discriminate against them. And so these are the type of proposals we've seen around the country for utilities to start to fight, if you will, the inevitable change and shift towards distributed energy resources. Sorry to be a naysayer or sourpuss, if you will. Yeah.
I was in Vermont this summer and I was really struck by huge quantities of solar panels, particularly on dairy farms. They assume that farmers are making a decision, an economic decision, that they're, you know, how are they going to use their land? Are they going to grow crops? Are they going to raise cows? Are they going to... So what are the economics of that, and how is the utility influenced that? And it looked like the farms were big. The solar farms were bigger than what the, you know, dairy farms were using themselves. I assume it was the economic use of their land. Can I just join for the last
Of course,
comment?
yeah.
Thank you.
So Vermont's a little unique because Green Mountain Power is by far the largest utility in Vermont, and they're so supportive of solar. You have just a different dynamic overall. And when it comes to, for instance, solar on dairy farms and such, what happens is in Vermont, there's a couple of different types of programs. They do have a net metering program. They also have something called a feed-in tariff. And that's basically the dairy farmers can get paid for every kilowatt hour they generate. So they can basically just get a check written by the utility. So you do see capacity being installed above and beyond what they would ever use on site. So I know we only have about 10 minutes left, but I wanted to get to what I think is the sexy part of the discussion. And how does this all tie together with how we think about energy usage by individual customers? So I'm going to go out on a limb and say that a lot of people that are doing zero net energy homes, passive homes, and whatever term you want to use, may have just offended some of you, but I'm just broad umbrella here. A lot of that motivation is probably for environmental reasons, right? We do have strong financial motivations too, if somebody's taking a long view here. But when you come right down to it, what is the appropriate boundary for thinking about environmentalism? When we build something or do something, and it's just to have a zero net home, is that actually what's best for society as a whole, and the environment as a whole? When you do a zero net home, you could be basically zeroing out your electric bill, which is pretty awesome. But So for instance, let me use an example here. Let's say you have a biodiesel generator, and you decide that you're going to run that biodiesel generator, do net metering, and you're going to run it in the middle of the night for whatever reason. That's actually when the price of electricity is the cheapest, so you're not providing as many benefits to society. Compared to if you decided to run that biodiesel generator when most people are using their electricity. Now, the reason I brought up this slide is because there are a lot of benefits of distributed generation. In the center here of the circle, you have the traditional benefits that utilities would think about: energy, capacity. Then you have the financial and the concentric rings going out. As you get further from the center, there's more and more controversy, but they're real and they can be quantified. When we think about these benefits, though, they're not uniform. They're not uniform per customer or per technology or anything like that. So when we think about a house or a small business, should we be thinking about building what's going to provide the most benefits? Or should we be just thinking about it from what's best from my perspective? Now, I want to use you as an example, because earlier you said you have 100 unit development, 65, okay, and you're saving the roof for green space, right? Perfectly reasonable approach. However, electricity tends to be most expensive in the most congested areas. Electricity prices are not uniform. So in the middle of Boston, it's difficult to get electricity into the city. And so you can actually have little islands of higher prices. These congested areas can have higher prices of electricity. That's just the way it works out. It's called congestion. ISO New England deals with this all the time. Anyway, the reason I bring this up is because if you start to motivate customers to install distributed generation where it provides the most value, meaning where prices are most expensive, it actually provides greater benefits to people in that area than if you provide uniform compensation, regardless of where it's installed. Another way to think about this is if you live in a really remote area that's not congested at all, meaning there's no difficulties in getting electricity there in any way, and you install distributed generation at that location, it's probably not going to have the same value than if you installed that distributed generation in an area that is really difficult to get electricity to. We may think of electricity as just a uniform price, but it's so far from the truth. We've been conditioned for over 100 years to think about electricity as the same price all hours of the day. But the price of electricity varies by time and location. And most customers are insulated from those two factors, time and location. If we start to think about what we're doing from a building perspective in the greater context of the electric grid and all of the negative stuff associated with the electric grid, emissions, high prices, then we could start to build infrastructure that benefits everyone. So basically, and this is philosophical questions, we're not going to be able to answer them in the next 5 minutes. But should a person or an entity, I use an entity for commercial institution, nonprofit, whatever, church. Should a person or an entity be concerned with just the impact on the environment from their perspective? Or should we start to think a little bit more broadly about the larger positive and or negative impact that their structure could have on the environment, the economy, and their neighbors? At what point do we draw the line of what we care about? So that was the sexy part.
So one of the interesting things to me about net metering, though, is that, as I understand it, I'm spinning my meter backwards, and then I get a credit against my winter usage. But if I go ultimately net positive, I don't get any payment.
Yeah. There's a very good reason for that, and you're probably going to hate it. The federal government. So there's a requirement in federal law that utilities cannot pay above avoided cost. Avoided cost is another way to think of the wholesale value of electricity.
Yeah.
So the utilities cannot cut a check to you for electricity at the retail rate, because that's above the voting cost.
At their rate?
The wholesale rate of electricity? Yes.
They don't.
They don't. They're not required to do it in Massachusetts.
So
it's not written
there's
into
no
law.
incentive to give more than net metering.
You do not have any incentive through net metering currently. That doesn't mean the rules can't change though. Right now in Massachusetts, we're at an inflection point. What are the policies going to be in the future? More than likely, the current net metering program and SREC program will not be maintained as they currently are designed. Just speaking honestly, there's probably going to be a change in some way, shape, or form.
What does that mean for people who already have agreements?
If I have it my way, and I'll fight for this, and I am fighting for this, customers that are already online will be grandfathered, meaning there won't be any changes to how they're treated. But more than likely, systems that come online in the future will probably be treated differently.
What's the future?
Whatever we make it.
January or 2018? I mean.
Well, I mean, a lot of that hinges on what the legislature decides to do over the next week and a half.
So we really do need to make those calls.
You really do need to make those calls, yes. Absolutely. Yes.
You said two things which sounded slightly contradictory. You said something against zero net energy. That on a
I'm not trying to bash zero net energy anyway.
Oh, well, I would like it if you did. But then you said that you really ought to concentrate the PV in densely populated areas. And if you take those two things together, the solution is not necessarily on your particular building, but on some building in the vicinity where you can share. And that's basically the way that we have thought about it, that is to find some place of less expensive land for rooftops which are not utilized for anything and will never be. And to put the PV there instead of putting it on a roof that could be a garden.
Yeah, you know, there's a competing interest here. There's no doubt about it. There's a lot of different ways you can use property. What I would like to see is a little bit more of a financial incentive for people to install, for instance, distributed generation where it's needed the most, where it can provide the most benefits to everyone. And once you have that financial motivation, you can make the decision, all right, does that raise the value that I would receive to the point where it's more important for me than, for instance, a green roof. And then that would be your choice. Or do I go with solar on my roof?
How big are these distribution networks? So if I'm in southeastern Mass and I have net positive and I'm putting, kilowatts into the system, Boston's congested, but don't they get there?
The short answer is
50 years ago yesterday was 35 million people and 80 million square miles? I'm not sure I got that right. That was 50 years ago. So that's how big the systems are.
Not from.
No, I was just going to say, it's important for us to keep in mind the different types of systems that we're dealing with here. We have transmission systems, which travel over long distances, and we have distribution systems, which tend to travel over much shorter distances. Most distributed energy resources are installed on the distribution network. And the electricity that you generate on it's called a radial feeder. I could probably pull it. Excuse me. I'll pull up a little bit of a diagram that hopefully will demonstrate this.
And then, unfortunately, that will have to be the last conversation. Much as it pains me to say this is
right.
This is amazing. Well, we have to do a part B, Nathan, sorry to say.
That's okay. So,
we'll submit questions beforehand.
Okay. I don't know why this is coming up.
That may be the BSA telling us.
Now, if you can envision, basically, you can think of generation located remotely, transmission lines that can go over large distances, and then you get to the distribution system to deliver electricity to houses, small businesses, and such. When you install distributed energy resources on the distribution system and you're exporting, more than likely that electricity is just going to be used on that distribution system, not going to be going back to the transmission system. And most of the time that's by design. Now, it changes when you're talking about larger installations. So large wind farms and such, those will be designed to feed into the transmission system. And the problem with congested areas, such as Boston, is getting transmission into the downtown area. Oh, it's very similar to traffic.
I so hate to stop this, but I think many of you can appreciate why I was on the edge of my seat for 8 hours listening to Nathan and his colleague. I mean, it's just it's the utility coming after me. Thank you. But we have to cut it off. The BSA gives us this space for free. They need their staff wants to get home as much as anybody at the end of the day. So I do want to thank Nathan for extraordinary eye-opening presentation. And next month we're going to talk about programs coming up in 2016. I would love to find a way to get you back if you come back. I think, because it feels like to me anyway that we just started some important conversations here. So.
I also want to thank you for being interactive. I really wanted this to be a discussion, not me preaching on you. So.
But just, to me, it's in retrospect, it's so obvious, but the idea that the value of a PV panel depends a lot on, the social value of a PV panel depends an awful lot on where it's deployed. I think we kind of knew that intuitively, but to me, that's a really important concept when we think about our zero net energy homes that are 20 miles, that are grid connected and 20 miles off a transportation grid. And, anyway, the meaning of what we're doing, that adds a whole new dimension to it. So anyway, we should, there's always a little bit of England. We can bend the rules a little bit, but for the most part, we should be doing what we can to vacate the premises. So thank you very much for
coming. By the way, Paul has my contact information, so if any of you have follow-up questions,